Very warm welcome back. Very warm welcome back to everyone to this, our fourth and final Clark lecture on A Voice of the Lyric, ? Past lectures, just in case you've missed any, can be found on the Trinity College YouTube channel. And because we have to be out of the lecture theatre today at 5:15, I'm going straight in, without more ado, to ask you to give another very warm welcome to Denise Riley, who's going to talk about something she's already been touching on all the way through these lectures, the voice of the poem. The poem. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And because we have to be out at 5:15 sharp, should anyone, it might be a bit unlikely, but if anyone wants to ask me anything about the lectures, then just catch me behind the grand piano and we can talk outside for as long as, well, within reason, because you all have homes to go to, but for as long as you would like, I will.
There's actually a room a little further down the corridor.
Is there?
You can sit when you have drinks.
Oh, good. Okay. So there is a talking room. Great. Thank you. As far as talking goes, I've been speaking a bit in previously, and I'll do that a bit more again today, about the lyric as self-overhearing, but I'm also, having taken up your time for 3 previous hours, that any critical self-overhearing seems to involve the presence of an audience in a rather Kleistian way, since I first want to apologize to people because I've been rather conscious in this position of self-enforced overhearing that the speaker only has the capacity to detect the undigestible raw oats in the porridge that she is mixing up for the audience when it's too late and when the speaker is before you. But I'll do what I've been doing previously, which is just to, for the benefit of the people who haven't been here before, I'll give a very brief summing up of my drift so far in yet another but quick Groundhog Day moment. So I've mentioned the emphatic weight now, according to the person of the poet with a capital P, more often a contrived persona. Synthetic competitiveness results, whipped up like aerated foam by those prize-giving ceremonies which line up their contestants. While Miss World contests have long and rightly felt disgracefully antiquated, Ms. or Mr. Poetry must still mince across a spotlit stage. Unholy as any beauty contest, these manufactured rivalries pitting poet against, quote, unquote, poet, must sit uneasily among at least some of those contenders. They'll dread an imposed limelight, realizing its sheer arbitrariness while flinching from its blinding glare. But such discomfort isn't, I think, only an outcome of those poets' temperaments or their emotional idiosyncrasies. It's not that they're, quote-unquote, vulnerable characters in special need of soothing handling. For I've been arguing it, they do have sound and extra-personal reasons for feeling awkward at being acclaimed as the unique originators of their books, to recognize that there may be something that I'm calling a voice of the poem might reassure them, because it could fortify their own intuition that the poem exceeds and the poem should exceed their quote-unquote mastery. If everyday language in use can outpace its speaker's intentions, poetry has its peculiar excesses. The beauty of poetic form is that it can exercise itself without the restraining choke chain wielded by the poet. Its vast repertoire of prosodic riches carries underestimated cognitive depths as well. The writer herself is already composed well in advance of her composing a thing. But if to some that comment sounds like an assault on their craft, as a salve to their possible unease, I've already in previous talks mentioned some aspects of European thinking from the early 19th century onwards, which attenuate the prominence of the capital P poet figure. Yet such strands of thought, including the several recommendations of poetic impersonality that I discussed, don't imply that the emotionally intense lyric need risk facing dismissal as biographical chatter. Again, to consider the poem's arrival as adventitious is pragmatic, in tune with the experience of many. It's not a capricious or a cloudy assertion. Recognizing the possibility, at least, of a voice of the poem does not mean that we're consigning both it and ourselves to the Vatic. As to whether it might prove a more fruitful approach than magnifying the voice of the author, that question could be set, as I tried to do last week, against some wider understandings of what's undeliberated as being composed of inner voice on the one hand and the powers of prosody on the other. However those two are held in play, such a doubled attention always informs your own work as it's emerging. It's a bit like hearing a furious crossfire between your inner voice and ear, where the ear's part also needs to be strong. And this lets you, as the listening writer, get snatched up into some unanticipated saying. There, the lyric poem might let you hang on its curve of sense sound. If we think of the poem as both evocation and invocation, it's also through enunciation that it brings itself into being. It's a calling aloud which can never be confident that it will be heard, and never should be confident of that, nor of its reception. For any lyric writer, I've been suggesting, who's not naturally at her or his ease with strenuous self-advertising, that might also suggest that to remain at once receptive and reticent isn't merely a style of quirky self-effacement, but is crucial for her or his reach towards a larger poetry of a properly poetic rather than a literary social ambition. So I'll turn to my first topic today, which is some objections to the notion that I'm trying to develop of the voice of the poem. So to try out my own programmatic suggestions, I'll press ahead with what I've already named, if gingerly, as that voice. And first, some objections. Why ever should the poem be posited as having a voice of its own? Isn't that an easy corrective? A device engineered to undercut the overemphasized voice of the author? And yes, of course, it would be plainly silly if you took the phrase "the voice of the poem" literally. And we already realise the contingencies of any poet's delivery. But I do feel as a point of conjecturing something reducible neither to the poem's performance nor to its semantic content. One way of considering it, the voice of the poem is a subset of the voice of language gone beyond its semantic brief. Still, as I was wondering last week, couldn't the poem's voice be understood plainly as a sounded transcription of its author's own inner voice? I don't think so. Partly, as I mentioned in my last talk, because the whole notion of someone's inner voice is, if you poke around in it, a nest of hornets. It rapidly turns out to be a tangle of inner and outer, the echoing presences of half-remembered rhymes, threats, old songs. A large part, I suspect a very large part of the practice of writing must lie in unwilled verbal recollection. And that's a far broader, less curated affair than any authorial hunt for the overheard past. It rises under its own impulses, at times maddeningly so. This broad rush of uninvited memory includes the unwanted echolalia of the inward ear. So reconsidering poetic authorship could include the hazards as well as the happy accidents of all those crisscrossing oral rhizomes which ramify without you, the writer, being conscious of them, let alone having solicited them. My second topic is conditions for hearing the voice of the poem. So my supposition is that neither the spoken or inner voice of the poet coincides with the voice of the poem, but we're still left with that question of what's distinctive about it, and how might its readers detect it, since it owns no speaking organ. It involves them in its very chances of becoming at all. It is the reader's attention that lets the print ease up off the page. Quote, "You open a text and it wakes. What is alive in it passes to the living." And that's a quotation from the frequently terrific Patricia Lockwood. That relies on close listening to reanimate the poem, long after its writer had listened intently enough for it to crystallize in the first place. But there must be enough life already there for the poem on the page to be awakened to something other than yawning. A poem that the reader can't get inside stays inert to her, eternally dull. Any reader or critic's attention will waver. If they aren't attuned to the work, it bores them, or it vexes their sensibility. They might take against its irony, so they slam it shut. So the poem's not only a site of hovering possibilities, but also of their eclipse or of plain repudiation. More optimistically, though, that flash of recognizing a rightness in the poem can lift the spirits. Let's not overlook the glad response to hearing some unexpected but longed for accuracy. Caught, for instance, in Wallace Stevens' lines, where he lays out a brief for his modern poem, which he says, "Like an insatiable actor, slowly and with meditation, speak words that in the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens, not to the play, but to itself, expressed in an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. So there Stephen's compacts are twofold conceptions of language itself, whose status as sheer sound, as only rustling, coexists in an ideal clarity of shared meaning. This fused nature is incarnate in the lyric. Its play across hearing and listening means that it can't be neatly demarcated into either camp. It's diffused, in part too, through its readers, in part via its writers, and in larger part through the musicality of its cadences, its prosody. And then the reach of poetic ambiguity extends well beyond the malleability of semantics. In its distributed and untethered being, it rather resembles the descriptions of thinking that the psychologist Jean Piaget noted as he listened to children in the Geneva of the 1920s. Thought for this group of 8-year-olds could be made of air, of smoke, or even of blood, while the work of thinking itself could well happen in the ears. Or thought was made exactly as it was for Tristan Tzara in the mouth. For some of Piaget's children, thought might be touched with a finger while breathing itself was voice. One boy's take on it offers a heady mix. Thought, he said, was mingled air and smoke, was interfused with breath, wind, and steam, reminding us of Turner in an odd way. Maybe the whereabouts of the poem's voice share this volatility in its unpredictable invocation, in how it lifts off the page, dies on the air, fades in different ears and mouths, is differently reborn. If the poem is in action, as Piaget's children understood thought to be, it's supremely demonstrative. It calls attention to itself, exhibits itself, whether you, the writer, like that or not. It might well turn aerial, like one of those faintly monstrous sunflower heads painted by Paul Nush, cartwheeling wildly above a landscape. For in its surge to reach completion, through gaining independence, the lyric must peel itself cleanly away from you, its transcribing writer. Then perhaps the head of Orpheus could serve as an emblem of sonic detachment here. Dismembered though he was by nymphs raging in their Bacchic frenzy, nonetheless, his severed head floated, still valiantly singing away, accompanied by his lyre downriver to the sea. But it's doubtful that the song of such a literally detached but seductively audible head could still count as embodied in the way that some readers take poetry itself to be. This Orphic body, in fact, is dead from the neck down. Such a vision of the lyric poem singing separation from its poet is borne up by its transpersonal inheritance, suffusing its sound formation as rhythm, especially by the overlooked powers of cadence in its rising or falling. In short, such a musicality, for lack of a more precise word, hasn't sprung from its author's willing. Though nor needs semantic content always be rehearsed. To come back to von Kleist, with whom I began, in his essay on the gradual production of thought while speaking, he describes the force of the occasion of utterance, which has no dedicated space, but is liminal, just as the tongue, neither quite inside nor quite outside, is among the body's liminal organs. And inner speech, by definition, has its life without the tongue's aid. It's only at the instant of its ejection as utterance that it finds its own presence. Kleist's point is that an idea flicks into life without any translation of a prior thought in the head. Instead, it's sheer event. A companion notion to this occasion of utterance could be an attentive listening or a linguistic receptivity. To be strongly susceptible to others' style of speech, then, must be vital for catching the poem as its own utterance. Again, as in Wallace Stevens' line, the poem is the cry of its occasion. It's taken me a very long while to grasp what Stevens probably meant by this. Perhaps there's a main occasion of the leaping into life of the uttered poem and the lesser occasion of its instigation, and these two are blurred. I'm moving on to my third topic, which is the question that I started to touch on last week, the sight of innerness. If we're still hunting the voice of the poem, as dispersed as it must be through the attentive ears of its readers, how and where could we pin it down? For what kind of distinct sonic existence might this lyric voice have? Does it only hang in the air, perhaps lightly, like transient music? And if so, wouldn't the printed poem, as a transcript, just resemble a score? But then there's a matter of the internal air which buoys up the poem. It's far less apt for orchestration than a more traditional score is, and has no authoritative performance. The voice of the poem can exist but subaudibly on paper during those moments that it's being traced by the reading eye. But even this act of silent reading entails a tacit performance, an inward vocalizing on the reader's part. She follows, or better, she threads herself through the poem and does so with her own inflections, perhaps reflecting that somewhere, well behind her own rendition, lay the author's. The notion of audiation is helpful here in its meaning of a sound which is mentally replayed, which is mentally, of course, silently replayed. Such oral yet literally unsounded sonic layerings do strongly recall those puzzles of place which haunt the idea of inner voice itself. Distributed between ears and eyes, between being heard and being read, and being heard in being read, the location of the voice of the poem must wander. Likewise, the reach of what constitutes the inner voice is, of course, itself historically mutable in such a way that I think there are repercussions for how we could grasp the speaking poem. That there's an elaborate history to the sight of such innerness has been widely argued, including by the literary historian Anne Ferry. Analysing 16th and 17th century lyric poetry, she holds that then the nature of innerness was not systematically contrasted with outwardness. Instead, it was in the action of transposing the inward outward that a true self was to be found. Accordingly, what stayed inward for the writers of those sonnets was just a remnant. It was only whatever couldn't be or hadn't yet been uttered. Hers was a scrutiny of the ways that poetry's language of innerness was in fact more of a series of transitions. whereas talk of a location suggests instead, and less helpfully, that some firm groundings in play, if we look hard enough. Rather, location itself might far better be understood if it's recast as mobility. In the case of inner speech and inner voice, it's replete with a history, not just of its disturbances, as captured, for example, by studies of aphasiology, but of thought's very archaeology. There, the place of linguistic affect seems not to have been understood as fixed, but more as furious connectivity. Its density needn't imply the least inertia. The old puzzle about the endlessly receding side of inner voice can be eased if we try instead to picture a lively interiority of connections. Then we might feel that things perk up. So can't we just transpose such innocence straight to the idea of the poem's voice? It sounds initially plausible, but I want to maintain that this analogy, although tempting, isn't exact enough. First, there's a question of how we've historically understood linguistic interiority, experienced as felt indwelling of language, a notion which is already sunk into imagined spatiality, but which now has a literally observable spatiality, given the relatively recent scrutiny by neurology of inner voice itself. Intuited interiority became visible through that magnetic resonance imaging, which can now catch and display internal speech. Indeed, since at least the last 20 years, it's even been able to detect the grasp of irony or the lack of that capacity through its neural tracings. There is, in fact, a whole library of neurological studies of the presence or the absence of the capacity to detect the ironic. While my initial interest lay in the actualityness of the inner voice, in that so much of it evidently stems from a kind of linguistic osmosis, a continual drawing on what's overheard. Later, I struck again by it as a touchstone for securing interiority itself. So there I had to return, suspecting that this ordinary inner voice might somehow highlight the peculiarities of pinning down the poem's voice. Admittedly, inner voice is a topic of alarming breadth, let alone embarrassing vagueness, and where a few specialized concerns speak to what's only nominally perhaps the same object. Inner voice, historically, has been associated with illumination, conviction, religious belief, and integrity, also with the wilder cards of enunciation, hallucination, and revelation. While inner speech as a topic has flourished in 19th and 20th century philosophies of mind, especially those concerned with the question of how thought is verbalized, which is already, to put it in a contentious manner, and introduces slippery notions like that of mental ease, for instance. This history of where in the head the inner voice is and whose it's understood to be has involved topologies that are both neurological yet almost ontological, in that they display a history of attitudes to self-consciousness in the sense of self-awareness itself. That apparently irreconcilable tension between the bone and the spirit is concentrated in the thought of the skull that nurses the brain, where everyone's impression of their own interiority somehow shelters. We might think of this inner feeling of a self is exemplified by our inner voices vibrating inside their cranial shell, while at the same time we have to recognize that both anatomy and neurophysiology demonstrate that the head is everywhere minutely crammed full. The long history of how the skull's inside has been figured exhibits a difficulty in picturing a filled head, dense with the cauliflower floret-like walls of the brain, its blood vessels enfolded in teguments pleated neatly in, without also envisaging a small vacant site to furnish a home to a residual self. Here the inner voice, historically contested as the lair of self-awareness, has habitually been allotted its space to whisper, as if in a true airhead, a faint, almost subauditory presence, where hearing is finally thinned out, nearly to the point of silence, yet where some originating spirit of language still seems to be earthed. But now that even silent monologues can appear as suddenly material, thanks to the new neurophysiology of inner speech itself, visible within the examined brain, these encounters of the known physiological fullness of the head with the persisting intuition of a self that's not quite a metaphysical residue are, though, I think, more than a simple incommensurability of descriptions, that it's so very awkward to elucidate the frustrations of seeing inside the skull, as with the "but where am I in this?" question, as asked by a well-known American neurophilosopher called Patricia Churchland when she saw her own MRI for the first time and asked, "But where am I in this?" That question does suggest that something is still awry, conceptually speaking. This new neural visibility has, I suspect, sharpened some pre-existing crisis of metaphor and has reinvigorated much older debates in the philosophy of mind. Exposure to the eye coexists with the continuing intuition of a distinct effective self secreted somewhere inside the visually excavated head. It's as if something escapes its material overwriting, as if a concealed compartment endures in the head, even after all the niches in which self-presence might lurk have been swept thoroughly through by the relentless torch beams of neurological scrutiny. How, though, is all this talk about cranial interiority or its lack relevant to the idea of the voice of the poem? For a start, to manage to speak out at all, the poem needs both a mass as presence, a verbal mass of presence, but also its inner space, as if it has to establish its privacy, shielding itself from the chivying interventions of its author. Then, in wondering about its uncertain and dispersed sites, questions of the envisaged density or airiness of inner verbal space are also crucial. The systematically thickened description of the inside of the brain given by neurophysiology seems, as I said, to leave no tiny spaces. Part of the unease that's so often voiced here may be the apprehension that something understood to be describable all the way through can't preserve any small space for the soul, or for what we could rephrase as animation, as if such comprehensively thick description would condemn its bearers to death in a radical absence of spirit. then it's as if, however awkwardly, the invocation of spirit or some contemporary equivalent, if we can find a good one, can offer a conceptual salve. I'll go on to my final section, which will be about materiality and mechanisms. If we turn to William Wordsworth's lines from 1798, from his Tintern Abbey, we hear this: a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. And if we add to that his phrase in the same poem, quote, "We see into the life of things," unquote, we might take those remarks absolutely seriously, weighing them word by word in order to get to the heart of both animation and the non-animated, which I think might be the task of trying to flesh out the notion of the voice of the poem. But isn't all this speculation about animation falling on the side of a hazy transcendence? Couldn't we do better by claiming what I'm calling the voice of the poem towards a perfectly materialist explanation? For example, a simple instance of poetic materiality could be a workable poem machine which emits sounds as well as spewing out texts, as Hans Magnus Enzensberger's used to do. So couldn't we do away with all this chatter about a poem's animation requiring it to possess some kind of inner space? Attractive in many ways though this model seems, and I've always, for myself, rather liked the poem as a little machine comparison, I'll touch on some misgivings. They're best illuminated by looking again at some historical perturbation about mechanisms that seem to have a disconcerting inner life of their own. Last week I mentioned Shaftesbury's struggles in his Ascot Martin notebooks, his struggles to reach some calm within the storm of his anguished nighttime monologues. But this last-ditch hope of his for the mind as a prudent adjudicator of inner turmoil had been threatened not only by the risks of insanity's self-estrangement, but also, if in a minor key, by the coming extra-philosophical innovations. 17th and 18th century philosophies of self-certainty had, if only at a distance, to reckon with the implications of their contemporaries' popular new technologies in the shape of developing mechanisms that could, apparently, animate the inert. While Descartes, among others, had surmised that animals were machines, soon enough machines became animals through that inventiveness which seemed to call into question the nature of animating consciousness. Once it could create moving elements, chess players, musicians, writing and weeping life-size dolls, melodiously warbling birds, to say nothing of Diderot's les bijoux indiscrets. Some of the earlier speaking machines imitated the actions of the vocal cords and windpipes. Eventually others, like the Abbé Michal's speaking heads of around 1783, were designed with sophisticated inbuilt keyboards, which, when pressed, would utter. Half a century after Shaftesbury's pondering, Somebody else I mentioned briefly before, Julien Auchet de la Métries' address to this vexed question of mechanization and motion would get him into grave trouble, both in France and elsewhere, because of his radical subsuming of consciousness itself within the domain of machinery. By 1748, the year of the publication of his L'Homme Machine, which preceded his equally enticing L'Homme Végétal, all manner of things could be persuaded to talk. Not only was La Métrie unbothered by the philosophical threats of the new clockwork, which had so troubled Shaftesbury, he made a virtue of it. His argument was for an elegantly seamless kind of mechanization, or a body-brain, indeed even a body-soul continuum. For him, the soul, as the principle of motion, depended on the organization of the body. So, the whole philosophical need to fret and worry over the nature of some obscure mind-body interface just fell away. If consciousness was indeed mechanical, in this particular sense of forming part of an organic whole, then much anguished speculation would mercifully become redundant. Following this, we could adopt the brisk attitude that thinking is another activity like walking or just being still. That would dispel the old worry about its nature, or, at least, would deprive it of metaphysical privilege. A theorist of radical contingency, La Métrie held that the driving principle in man-machine is the imagination, but there need be no divine maker at work behind this clockwork of being, because in a mechanical model, some kind of lubricant would be needed. So La Métrie supplies his machinery with the oils of imagination and motion, but both are figured as self-propelling. And he says, the human body is a machine which winds its own springs. It is the living image of perpetual movement. End of quote. He works with the concept of the totality. If now anyone asks me, where is this innate force in our bodies? I answer that it resides in the organization of the whole body. Furthermore, who can be sure that the reason for man's existence is not simply the fact that he exists? Perhaps he was thrown by chance on some spot on the earth's surface. Nobody knows how nor why, but simply that he must live and die like the mushrooms which appear from day to day, or like those flowers which border the ditches and cover the walls. Lightened by this idea of the fortuitous, La Métrie continues, the weight of the universe, therefore, far from crushing a real atheist, does not even shake him. Such a polemic couldn't have met with a placid reception. A scandal of an author, La Métrie, was run out of more than one town. He ended up in Prussia, protected by Frederick the Great. Later, he wrote a treatise on happiness. But what's the pertinence of his kind of radical materialism to my notion of the poem's voice? It is the fact that it alters the assumed need for innerness. Now there's no dedicated, airy thinking space, no imagined cavity in the skull, and no semi-detached home for the soul. It all sounds like a blessed simplification. And it might be tempting to suppose that this materialist approach kills off the speaking poem, and with it, that sensed rustling of words that flock outside its invoking. And maybe in the end, it's not significantly harder to decipher the voice of the poem than to contemplate the voice of a human, except for the latter, we have working descriptions of its mechanism. And I see I hadn't quite got, as I thought, to my very final section, which is that of animation. Because I launch into another but that brisk conclusion would weaken and oversimplify what materialism can mean, what the term materialism can mean. For significantly, La Métrie underlines the principle of movement as a decisive factor in his materialism. Then what is it that generates movement as animation in a poem? And now I have to be embarrassingly self-referential because I'm going to mention a short piece that views the poem as a site of a contained reanimation. Its metaphor is the columbarium that you will find inside cemeteries. Often a tall stone wall pierced with slots containing pierced with slots containing wooden or metal boxes, reliquaries for the ashes of the dead. And the carpenter that I mention in the poem might be the poet, but to my mind that carpenter is more like language itself, although here it's figured, language is figured counterintuitively as solicitors. Boxy piece. Exhibit of small boxes made from wood to house their thought, and each an open coffin of the not dead with their churring. Satin-lined frames stuck square in blocks nested to a columbarium. Then mumble closet doves whose fond carpenter drills piercings for more air, won't let you flap. So this poem wonders about how an inner liveliness can cohere with the captivating fact of the object. That's so noticeable in 20th century modernism's aesthetic. Or, if you like, it's where Wallace Stevens' jar sits famously and stoutly on its hill in Tennessee. The thing, thick-set all through, meets with a restless longing for its own permeability, even with an impulse to punch holes into it as if to fashion a colander. A thoroughgoing thickness expunges any margin between its inside and its outside. The object, stuffed with itself, halts only at its own edges. But this abrupt cessation of internally undifferentiated being is rather alarming, as if any internality has been stiflingly compacted. Skinless, it remains objectively thick. It stops and gives way to the air outside it, but not through any border. Its farthest bounds are the same as its middle. Suffocation ensues. Even a human self pursuing this train of thought won't feel much of a skin between itself and the world. I run right up to the edge of myself, and abruptly the outside world begins where I'm stopped. The very impenetrability of a sculptured object can provoke a bullish antagonism in the onlooker, who can't much like its solid silence. There it sits, mutely full to the gills with its own matter. A more sympathetic thing would, in contrast, need to be figured as porous, apt to be aerated. It isn't the object per se that gives rise to disquiet, for anything with a built-in openness, like a vase or a bowl or a trough, is perfectly bearable. Rather, it's the uniformly dense thing which in that thickness eliminates the possibilities of both secrecy and privacy. Someone dwelling on this remorselessness of solid things may feel their lack of room for even a corpuscle to move. A breathless dread of mute intractability rises as a dark emanation from Wordsworth's quatrain. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. Let's leave this thought of thickness, or rather the possibilities of its punctuation, towards a sculpted body topped by its head, since it's easier to grasp a charged interiority visually than it is verbally. In this vein, for instance, are several styles of sculpture from the Yoruba regions of Nigeria. Their conception of a distinct inner head is strong, illustrating in stone the belief in an extra head sited inside the skull. An accompanying Yoruba prayer runs, quote, "May my inner head not spoil my outer one." So then, inside the head, we have a thing that thinks inside itself. Yet even the most resolutely solid things may occasionally seem to exude an interiority, despite the fact that evidently they have none. For instance, those vast Buddhist statues held in global museums can appear, if you wait in front of them, to breathe out their meditative inwardness, carved from solid wood, whether from one enormous block or from several tightly conjoined blocks. Such Buddhas and Bodhisattvas exhale an air of intensely absorbed contemplation, but this owes nothing to their material being. So what then is really inward about them? That naive-sounding question does point up the strangeness of what's often termed expressiveness, whether in sculpture or in poetry, as if the nature of what we mean by expressiveness is somehow obvious. Like our historical intuitions and present impressions of our own interior being, as well as of the world's forms of inwardness, the poem itself can be sensed as simultaneously packed and airy. It is both historical thing and transient sounding. That tensile complexity can be resolved both into and as the distinctive voice of the poem. It may seem always on the verge of falling away from more familiar notions of voice, yet in sustaining its poise, it does hold its tautness. So again, thank you for your patience.